Hi everyone, it's me Julienne. Welcome to the channel. For today's video, we're going to be talking about how I study Japanese. First and foremost, I just want to say that this is a real beginner's guide because I am still studying hiragana and katakana. I'm not yet in kanji, but I do know or encountered a few bits of kanji here and there, but I haven't really dig deep and study kanji. Let's go ahead and get started. The very first thing that I did is I studied hiragana and katakana. Hiragana is pretty similar with katakana, although katakana has way more alphabet, and so that's where I actually started. I really learned it letter by letter. I started every single day to write each letter of the alphabet of hiragana or katakana. And I didn't move on to katakana before I finished hiragana. Since I am already familiar with those two, what I usually do right now is I just have a review. I usually write or do this chart that I just got from the internet. I usually just write down and try my best to remember what's the difference between katakana and hiragana. So this chart is comprised of two alphabets, and the hiragana and katakana is side by side each other, so it's easier to recognize which is which. The second thing that I do, I have a hiragana activity or a katakana activity. Just because I am familiar with hiragana and katakana doesn't mean I stop learning it. I always have like one worksheet or two worksheets for me to remember what is katakana and what is hiragana. I don't usually follow any textbook. I just search hiragana activities or katakana activities online on Google and just download it and print it. Sometimes it's fun, like a crossword puzzle or like a game, a word find, or it's just a basic writing activity that's also fun. I really love these activities because it keeps me moving of learning Japanese. I write down the vocabulary that I learn from the activities that I have done. So whenever I will do a hiragana activity, there are definitely a lot of vocabulary. Sometimes I note some of it, sometimes I don't. So I would usually write it down to a notebook, which is my vocabulary notebook. This notebook is divided into hiragana and katakana. And then whenever I write vocabulary, I do not usually highlight the translated version of it. So what I mean is that I will write it in hiragana in a pen, and then I will write the meaning of it or the translation of it in a pencil, so that when I am able to recall and I can remember already the vocabulary, I will erase the pencil part, and so I will just directly memorize it by itself. I do know the translation is good. It's easy to remember vocabulary, but also it's hard to associate words to each other because every language is different. The way I express in English is different, and the way Japanese supposed to be expressed is different, and so it's really hard to rely on translation. But when it comes to the very basic vocabulary such as nouns, verbs, adjectives, it's definitely a very good strategy. Next thing that I do after I have done all of this warm-up, it's kind of like a warm-up to the biggest lessons that I usually do every single day. The fourth thing that I do is a Genki book. So Genki 1, I am in Genki 1, and I usually do one lesson per day. I know this is very limited in comparison to other people, but this is what works for me because I wanted to absorb the knowledge and I want to build my foundation. And since Japanese is different from English, and so to my mother tongue, which is Filipino, it's also hard for me to absorb the idea of Japanese, and learning one lesson per day is already enough for me, and sometimes it actually is still hard. In every one lesson of Genki Book, there is usually around 7 topics in each, and so I don't usually force myself to finish one lesson per day. If I cannot finish it, then it's fine. I can move on to the rest the next day. I also studied hand in hand with the Genki workbook. If I'm studying lesson 3, topic 1 in Genki textbook, I will also study it in the workbook, one lesson per day and one activity per day usually. But again, if the topics is really hard, for example, the other day I was studying about particles is really hard, and so I did take 2 or 3 days to study it, and that's totally fine, you know, like we're not rushing here. We are just studying vocabulary, association, or flashcards. Now this is really beneficial for me most of the time because translation isn't a very good idea sometimes because your brain takes a lot of process to translate everything. But what I do is I usually associate. So what I mean by that is I usually make flashcards of writing the Japanese vocabulary on the other side and then a drawing to the next. I'm not a very artistic type of person. I don't have very good drawing skills, but then I try my best to really associate it so that it's easier for me to remember it by the image and not by translation, and so the vocabulary will stick to my brain. Now when it comes to speaking, it's really hard to study Japanese by yourself, but when it comes to speaking, it's actually easier in my idea because I did study English speaking by myself. I would usually look at myself in the mirror, copy other people's accents, and like practice pronunciation, all of those things. And so I did also apply it now that I'm studying Japanese. I'm also applying whatever I learned when I was studying English. I would usually have speaking videos. There are a lot of YouTube videos wherein they accumulated phrases that are being used or expressions that are being used every single day. And so I usually listen to that, not every single day, but sometimes I do that every single day. And so for me to get familiarized with how to pronounce words and how to pronounce vocabularies and how to really say this conversational Japanese, I usually use my AirPods, and like rather than listening to a music, I would usually listen to daily Japanese phrases, and so unconsciously my brain is kind of getting and absorbing the Japanese language. So those are the systematic and proper way of how I usually study. Now let's move on to the things that I usually do to unconsciously study Japanese, but then not really trying really hard. You know what I mean? Yeah, the first thing is I usually listen to Japanese songs. I do not understand Japanese songs at all at the moment. Another thing is like using apps, Grabs, Duolingo, Bumpo. Of course, watching anime. Watching anime is a fun thing to kind of absorb the Japanese language. In addition to that, I also consistently read Japanese literature, Japanese books. It helps a lot to understand how to study Japanese because studying Japanese involves a lot of culture, and if you're studying Japanese right now, you will know exactly what I mean. You will understand a lot of Japanese culture once you study their language. And I know not only this applies to Japan, but it also applies to the rest of the countries of the world, that when we study their language, we became more aware of their culture. So this is how I usually study Japanese. If you're also willing and wanting to study Japanese, I hope you can learn 1 or 2 from this video. And if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe down below because I really would want to create a lot of study with me or self-studying Japanese video with me. There are so many strategies and methods that have helped me a lot, and I hope to share it to those people that just, you know, want to learn a different language and to learn a different culture, and they're fascinated with Japan, and so they wanted to learn the Japanese language. That's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe down below and be part of our family, our community, and I will just see you next time. Bye!
So really you ain't gonna hit me back, yeah. Now it's all just you got me on blast, yeah.